I knew it was Bigfoot the moment it stepped out of the mist and stood upright right in my headlights. It was nearly 9 feet tall, with shoulders so massive I felt like the road was shrinking around it. My hand had barely touched the radio when it turned toward a dead tree by the shoulder, leaned down, and hoisted a log the size of a car hood. I still remember thinking, no animal can do that. Then it pivoted its hips. The branch left its grip, hurling straight for the windshield. I barely had time to duck before the SUV shattered in a deafening crash. This is Victor, and tonight I'm taking you to a corner of the Washington woods where an ordinary police report hides an inexplicable story. The version I'm sharing is pieced together from accounts circulating within the Bigfoot community. I cannot verify that every detail is factual, nor can I rule out that parts of it have drifted into folklore after countless retellings. So, listen with an open mind. If you've ever encountered something strange in the wild, share your story, and if you still believe, drop the word Bigfoot in the comments. Now, let's head back to Lewis County, late October 2023. Caleb Mercer had spent almost 10 years learning how to stay calm when other people could not. At 37, the deputy sheriff with the Lewis County Sheriff's Office had already worked violent domestic calls, serious crashes, missing person searches, to know that darkness could make ordinary things look strange. He did not consider himself fearless. He simply trusted training more than rumors. That was why the reports coming from Cinderbrush Hollow never seemed especially convincing to him. Cattle had disappeared. Sections of fencing had been damaged. Several residents had reported deep, low sounds somewhere beyond their properties after midnight. Some people quietly used the word Bigfoot, but Caleb never wrote that word in a report. As far as he was concerned, the forest had plenty of explanations that did not require a creature from folklore. Bears could be powerful, cougars could be difficult to track, and frightened witnesses could turn a distant shape into something much larger than it really was. Still, one detail bothered him. When cattle vanished around Cinderbrush Hollow, owners often found no carcass, no blood, and no obvious trail leading away from the property. Caleb noticed that pattern because his job had taught him to notice patterns before stories. On an October evening in 2023, he was assigned another patrol through the area, and he treated it like any other shift. Before leaving, he checked the lights on his patrol SUV, tested the radio, secured his equipment, and reviewed the locations where the recent reports had occurred. The routine felt reassuring. He knew what his job required: observe, document, respond, and keep moving. The first stop was a stretch of fencing belonging to a local cattle owner who had reported damage earlier that day. Caleb parked beside the dirt road and walked toward the broken section with a flashlight in one hand. The temperature had dropped quickly after sunset, and moisture hung close to the ground. His boots pressed into soft soil beside the fence as he studied the posts. At first, nothing looked remarkable. Then he noticed the angle of one post. It had been pushed sideways with enough force to pull several strands of wire tight, while another section had been bent downward. The damage did not look like an animal simply squeezing through. Caleb crouched and examined the dirt beneath the wire. There were impressions, but they were too incomplete to identify confidently. He shifted his flashlight across the ground, searching for a clear paw print, claw mark, or trail. What he found instead was a broad disturbance that disappeared into grass and shadow. He stood, looked toward the dark hillside, and felt the first small shift in his confidence. It was not fear. It was the irritation that came when evidence refused to fit the simplest explanation. The cattle owner had also mentioned seeing a tall figure on the ridge several nights earlier. From a distance, he had assumed it was a person wearing a dark coat. Caleb recorded the statement mentally, but did not give it much weight. People often saw silhouettes differently at night. The owner had no photograph, no clear description, and no reason to believe the figure was anything unusual. Caleb finished examining the fence and returned to his SUV. As he opened the driver's door, he heard a deep sound somewhere beyond the trees. It lasted only a few seconds. The vibration was low enough that he felt it more than clearly heard it, and that made him pause. He shut off the engine and stood beside the vehicle, listening. The forest settled around him. Leaves moved softly. A distant branch cracked. Then everything went quiet again. Caleb waited another moment before turning the radio volume down. He wanted to hear the woods without the steady static in his ear. Nothing followed. He eventually climbed back into the SUV and continued his patrol, telling himself that the sound could have come from almost anything. That explanation satisfied him until later that night, when the road carried him deeper towards Cinderbrush Hollow. By then, the fog had thickened. At approximately 1:40 in the morning, Caleb was driving slowly along a narrow dirt road that cut between tall trees and wet brush. His headlights reached only a short distance ahead before disappearing into the mist. He rounded a tight bend and saw something standing in the middle of the road. His first thought was simple: bear. The shape was too large to be a person, and the way it stood upright made a bear seem like the most reasonable possibility. Caleb immediately reduced his speed. His hands tightened around the steering wheel while he watched the figure through the windshield. The headlights illuminated wet black hair across a massive body. The shoulders were extraordinarily broad, the arms hung far lower than those of a human being, and the head looked surprisingly small compared with the torso. Then the figure took one deliberate step forward. Caleb felt the explanation he had reached collapse. A bear did not move like that. The creature stood close to 9 feet tall, and it remained completely still after taking the step. It did not run from the headlights. It did not turn toward the trees. It simply looked directly at the patrol SUV. Caleb's training told him to identify the threat, create distance, and call for assistance. His mind struggled to keep up with what his eyes were reporting. He slowed almost to a stop and switched on the emergency lights. The red and blue reflections moved across the wet road and disappeared into the fog. His right hand reached for the radio. He intended to report a large animal blocking the roadway, because that was the only description he could imagine saying without sounding irrational. Before he could finish the thought, the creature turned away from him. It looked toward a dead tree standing beside the road. Caleb watched as it bent down and placed both hands around a massive branch. The branch was nearly as long as his patrol vehicle. For a fraction of a second, Caleb expected the creature to struggle with it. Instead, the branch rose smoothly from the ground. The movement was so effortless that his brain rejected what he was seeing. He instinctively pressed harder on the brake. The SUV stopped. His hand tightened around the radio. The creature turned back. Caleb saw the branch move through the fog, and then he understood that it was being thrown. He had just enough time to brace himself. The impact came with a violent crash. The windshield exploded into a web of cracks and fragments. The hood folded under the force, and Caleb was thrown sideways against the interior. For several seconds he could not understand where he was. His ears rang. The cabin smelled of dust, glass, and something hot from the damaged electrical system. He tried the driver's door first. It would not open. Caleb pushed harder, then realized the frame had been bent. He forced himself to move across the front seats toward the passenger side. His breathing became faster, but his training returned in pieces. Get out, create distance, call for help, do not freeze. He reached the passenger door and shoved it open. Cold air rushed into the cabin. Caleb dropped onto the ground beside the SUV and pushed himself upright. That was when he saw the creature moving toward him. It was no longer standing at the center of the road. It was walking slowly through the fog, each step controlled and heavy enough to make the damaged vehicle seem to vibrate. Caleb backed away without turning around. He wanted to reach open ground, but his eyes stayed on the creature because every instinct warned him that looking away could be a mistake. The creature did not roar. It did not charge. It simply approached. That restraint frightened Caleb more than a sudden attack would have. A wild animal acting from panic might have behaved unpredictably. This thing appeared to be choosing every movement. Caleb noticed an unfamiliar smell around him, something like hot metal mixed with the sharp odor of burned wiring. The smell came from the damaged SUV, but it seemed stronger near the creature. He swallowed and tried to steady his breathing. The creature stopped. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Caleb could see water shining on its dark hair. He could make out the enormous width of its shoulders and the unusual length of its arms. He could also see that its attention had shifted. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as if it were listening to something beyond the road. Caleb stood frozen, unable to identify the sound the creature seemed to hear. Then the Bigfoot turned its head to the forest. A low growl came from its chest. The sound was so deep that Caleb felt it in his ribs. He expected the creature to advance again. Instead, it waited. A second sound answered from somewhere far deeper among the trees. The response carried through the fog with the same low frequency, only more distant. Caleb understood something he had not been prepared to understand. Whatever stood in front of him might not be alone. The realization changed the situation instantly. One enormous creature was already beyond anything he could explain. The possibility of another one meant the entire forest could contain something he could neither see nor predict. Caleb did not wait to find out. He turned and ran toward a civilian vehicle that had been left several hundred yards away after an earlier fence inspection. His legs felt unsteady, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Behind him, he could hear his own breathing and the wet ground breaking beneath his boots. He did not hear footsteps chasing him, and somehow that made the silence worse. He reached the parked vehicle, forced the door open, climbed inside, and grabbed the emergency radio. His hands shook as he called for assistance. He gave the location, reported the destroyed patrol SUV, and requested another unit. He deliberately avoided the word Bigfoot. He could not bring himself to say it over the radio. Nearly an hour later, another unit reached the area. By then, the forest had returned to silence. The creature was gone. Caleb was alive. His patrol SUV remained where he had left it, damaged beyond immediate use. The responders examined the scene and found no obvious person, no additional witness, and no clear explanation for what had happened. The branch lay beside the vehicle. Its size immediately drew attention. It was large enough to make the official explanation uncomfortable. Yet there was no simple way to document how it had reached the SUV. Caleb watched the others examine the damage and felt a strange distance from the scene. They were looking at a vehicle accident. He was looking at the place where a 9-foot creature had stood less than 20 meters away and deliberately lifted a branch with both hands. He knew that if he told them everything, the focus would shift from the destroyed SUV to him. They would ask whether he had been disoriented by the crash, whether darkness and fog had affected his judgment, or whether the impact had caused him to misinterpret what he saw. Caleb could answer every question, but he knew none of his answers would make the experience easier for them to accept. So he remained silent. The official explanation would eventually say that a large branch had broken because of weather and fallen onto the patrol vehicle. Caleb heard the explanation without arguing. He understood why it would be written that way. It was simple, familiar, and defensible. His own version was none of those things. Yet, as he stood beside the wreckage, one thought kept returning. The branch had not fallen. It had been lifted. It had been thrown. And whatever had thrown it had looked directly at him before walking away. For the first time in his career, Caleb Mercer found himself facing a danger that could not be placed neatly inside a police report. The drive back that morning was almost silent. Caleb sat in the passenger seat of another deputy's vehicle while the damaged SUV remained behind in the fog. He watched the trees pass through the window and tried to separate memory from adrenaline. He could still picture the creature's face, although he had no photograph to prove it had been there. What unsettled him most was not its size. It was the pause. After throwing the branch, it had walked toward him with every advantage, yet it had stopped before reaching him. Caleb replayed that moment repeatedly, searching for an explanation that felt ordinary. Perhaps the sex sound had called it away. Perhaps the creature had been defending a territory and decided the threat was over. Perhaps it had simply wanted the vehicle gone. He could not know. By the time he returned to the station, he had already made one decision. He would finish the immediate paperwork, but he would not volunteer for another night patrol through Cinderbrush Hollow. He needed distance before deciding what came next. For the moment, however, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Something enormous had stood in the road, watched a police officer approach, and responded with deliberate force. Caleb had entered the forest expecting to investigate missing cattle. He left it carrying a question that would follow him far beyond that night. He did not yet know that within days, evidence would appear at the roadside and force him to reconsider the encounter. For now, he knew that the forest no longer felt empty, and that thought stayed with him throughout the drive home that morning. The morning after the encounter, Caleb returned to the Lewis County Sheriff's Office, with a headache, stiff shoulders, and the strange feeling that everyone around him was moving through an ordinary day while he was carrying something that could not fit inside ordinary language. The damaged patrol SUV had been left at Cinderbrush Hollow until daylight crews could examine it properly. Caleb had already given the basic account. He had encountered a large animal. The animal had caused the collision, and he had escaped on foot before calling for help. He had carefully avoided describing the 9-foot figure standing upright in the headlights. He had also avoided mentioning the second low growl that had answered from the forest. That omission stayed with him as he sat through the first review of the incident. His supervisor studied photographs of the windshield, the crushed hood, and the branch lying beside the road. The damage looked severe, but there was no obvious evidence of another vehicle, a person, or a conventional mechanical failure. The branch became the center of attention because its size made the official explanation uncomfortable. Caleb watched the investigators measure it, photograph the broken ends, and compare its position with the damage to the SUV. He already knew what they were going to conclude, because the simplest explanation was the one everyone could defend. Inside, he felt a growing separation between what the room believed had happened and what he knew he had seen. The investigators measured the angle of the windshield damage and examined the hood for signs of impact. The glass had been struck from the front and slightly downward, which did not fit neatly with a branch simply dropping from above. The trunk section lying beside the vehicle also showed no obvious indication that it had been hanging directly over the road before the collision. He knew the difference between a falling object and something thrown with force. Still, he kept that conclusion to himself. Saying it aloud would lead to another question, and that question would lead directly to the part of the story he could not explain. His supervisor eventually described the event as an unfortunate weather-related accident and told Caleb that he should take the rest of the day to recover. Caleb nodded. He was grateful for the permission to leave, but the word accident bothered him. The branch had not drifted down through the fog. Caleb remembered the way it had risen in the creature's hands effortlessly and then traveled toward the windshield. The memory was too precise to dismiss as confusion caused by the impact. On the drive home, Caleb replayed the scene in fragments. He remembered the wet black hair, the massive shoulders, the long arms, and the creature's steady attention. He remembered the pause after the vehicle was struck. Most of all, he remembered that the creature had approached him slowly instead of rushing forward. That detail became more disturbing each time he considered it. A frightened animal might attack blindly. A territorial animal might charge. The creature had done neither. It had appeared to decide what it wanted to do, and then it had stopped. Caleb tried to convince himself that the second sound from the forest had interrupted the encounter. That explanation was possible, and because it was possible, he held on to it. Perhaps another animal had called from the trees. Perhaps the creature had heard something that mattered more than Caleb. Perhaps the entire sequence had been a strange chain of animal behavior that only looked deliberate because Caleb was frightened. He wanted one of those explanations to be true. None of them felt convincing. By afternoon, Caleb was back at the office because routine was easier than sitting alone with his thoughts. A fellow deputy asked about the crash and joked that the forest had finally won an argument with him. Caleb gave a brief smile, but the humor did not reach him. He had spent years hearing people exaggerate what they saw in the woods. He had dismissed stories about enormous footprints, unexplained calls, and dark figures moving between trees. Now he understood how those stories could begin. The problem was that he could not tell whether his own experience had made him more objective or simply more willing to believe what he had once rejected. That uncertainty made him cautious. He did not want to become a witness who filled gaps with imagination, so he decided to return to the scene in daylight, not to hunt for Bigfoot, but to test his memory against physical evidence. Several hours later, Caleb went back toward Cinderbrush Hollow. The fog had lifted, revealing the road, the trees, and the damaged ground with much greater clarity. He walked around the SUV slowly, studying every mark. The branch was still beside the vehicle. Up close, its size was even more impressive. Caleb placed a hand against the rough surface and looked toward the trees. He tried to imagine the branch falling naturally. He considered the height of the surrounding trunks, the angle of the broken limbs, and the position where the branch had landed. The picture did not fit. A falling branch should have followed gravity. The damage on the SUV suggested a trajectory that came forward and downward, as if the object had been thrown from somewhere near the road. Caleb crouched beside the windshield and traced the direction of the impact with his eyes. The conclusion was uncomfortable, but his training made it difficult to ignore. Something had sent that branch into his vehicle. He walked farther along the road and found another detail that made him stop. The ground near the shoulder showed several deep impressions, but they were incomplete because of the wet soil and vehicle disturbance. Caleb photographed them anyway. He did not label them as footprints belonging to anything unusual. He simply recorded their position. As he stood, he remembered the creature turning toward the dead tree before the impact. That memory gave the physical evidence a new meaning. The branch had not been an accident, it had been part of the encounter. Caleb returned to his SUV and sat inside for several minutes, staring through the broken windshield. The empty road looked completely different in daylight. Nothing moved between the trees, nothing made a sound. Yet Caleb could still feel the presence he had experienced there. He knew that feeling was not evidence, so he forced himself to separate emotion from observation. The observations were enough to make him uneasy without adding anything. Over the next few days, Caleb became increasingly reluctant to discuss the incident. His colleagues assumed he was dealing with the normal aftermath of a serious patrol accident. They suggested taking leave, getting some sleep, and letting the bruises heal. Caleb appreciated their concern, but he felt that explaining the truth would create a different kind of problem. If he said he had seen a 9-foot Bigfoot, people would either laugh or begin treating him like a man who had lost control of his judgment. Neither reaction would help. More importantly, Caleb worried that someone might decide to investigate Cinderbrush Hollow personally. He had no desire to send another deputy into those woods because of something he could not prove. Still, one question kept pulling him back toward the case. What had happened to the branch? He asked to see the photographs again and compared them with the original scene. The branch had landed beside the vehicle rather than becoming lodged on top of it. The windshield showed concentrated damage. The hood was pushed inward. The angle remained wrong for the weather explanation. Caleb made notes for himself, but kept them separate from the official report. He knew that if he wrote what he believed, the report would become a statement about an unidentified creature instead of a record of a damaged patrol vehicle. He was not ready to make that choice. Then, several days after the crash, a maintenance worker traveling along the forest road noticed a series of large impressions near the original scene. The worker reported them because their size was unusual enough to catch his attention. Caleb heard about the discovery and drove out to look. This time he arrived with a different mindset. He was no longer trying to prove what he had seen. He wanted to know whether the ground could answer one specific question. Had the creature remained nearby after Caleb escaped? The impressions were larger than 16 inches and unusually deep. Their edges had been softened by moisture, but the overall shape was clear enough to suggest a broad foot with a distinct forward section. Caleb followed them carefully. He expected to find a trail leading from the forest toward the road, followed by another trail returning into the trees. Instead, the impressions appeared behind the location of the patrol SUV and continued parallel to the road. Caleb stopped and looked back toward the wreckage. The pattern made his stomach tighten. If the tracks belonged to the creature, then it had not simply appeared, attacked the vehicle, and disappeared. It had moved along the road after Caleb left the SUV. He followed the impressions until they ended near the place where he had escaped toward the civilian vehicle. Caleb stood there for a long time. He imagined himself running through the fog, focused only on reaching safety. He had heard no footsteps behind him. He had never looked back long enough to know whether the creature followed. Now the tracks suggested that something had been moving in the same direction. The discovery changed his memory of the escape. Until that moment, Caleb had believed the distance between himself and the creature increased as soon as he ran. Now he had to consider the possibility that the creature had watched him leave. The maintenance worker had no explanation for the tracks. Caleb photographed them and resisted the temptation to make a conclusion. He knew that unusual tracks could be misread, especially after rain, yet the position was difficult to ignore. The impressions began after the vehicle, continued along the road, and ended where Caleb had broken away from the scene. That sequence created a question that was far more unsettling than the original encounter. If the creature had followed him, why had it stopped? Caleb returned to the station and found himself thinking about the answer while working through routine calls. He noticed that every explanation created another problem. If the creature had been frightened, why approach the SUV? If it had been defending territory, why stop before reaching him? If it had been hunting, why allow him to escape? And if it had followed him deliberately, what had it wanted? Caleb could not answer any of those questions. He only knew that the evidence was beginning to form a pattern. A few days later, another piece of information reached him from a source he had not expected. A hunting camera, located more than a mile from the crash site, had captured a blurry image around the same time as the encounter. The owner initially considered the image unimportant because the frame was dark and heavily distorted. Caleb asked to see it. When the photograph appeared on the screen, he immediately felt the same tension return to his chest. Between two tree trunks stood a tall, dark figure. It appeared to be moving on two legs. The image was too poor to identify the subject, but its proportions were difficult to dismiss. The figure seemed far taller than an ordinary person. Caleb studied the frame several times. The figure had stopped and turned its head toward the camera before disappearing behind the trees. That movement reminded him of the creature on the road. It had also stopped and looked directly toward him. Caleb did not tell the camera owner that he believed the images showed the same thing. He simply asked for the original file and the exact timestamp. The time placed the figure within the same general period as the patrol crash. The evidence was still inconclusive, but the coincidence made Caleb uncomfortable. The camera owner mentioned that other strange reports had come from the same area. Caleb listened without encouraging speculation. He had learned enough to know that stories became less reliable when people began adding details for each other. He wanted only what could be remembered and checked. Before leaving, he asked whether anyone else had reported seeing a large figure on the ridge near the cattle properties. The answer led him to a rancher who had made a report weeks earlier. Caleb visited the rancher at his property and asked him to describe the sighting without offering any suggestion about what it might have been. The man remembered standing near his cattle after sunset when he noticed a tall figure on the hillside. At first he thought it was a person wearing a dark jacket. The distance made the figure difficult to judge. He watched it for several seconds before it disappeared among the trees. Later, after finding unusually large tracks around his livestock enclosure, he became less comfortable with his original explanation. Since then, he had been locking the gates every night. Caleb listened carefully. The rancher did not sound excited or eager for attention. If anything, he seemed embarrassed by the story. That made Caleb take it more seriously. The man had no photograph and no proof, but his account matched the same broad details Caleb had already encountered. A tall, upright figure, dark coloration, the same general area, and signs of unusual activity around livestock. Caleb thanked him and left without telling him what he had personally seen. He did not need to. Both men understood that the conversation had moved beyond ordinary wildlife. As Caleb drove away, he looked toward the ridge where the rancher had first seen the figure. The hillside appeared empty beneath the late afternoon light, yet the absence of movement no longer reassured him. He had begun this investigation believing that every strange report probably had a normal explanation. Now several independent pieces of information were pointing in the same direction. None could prove Bigfoot existed. Together, however, they made the official explanation increasingly difficult for Caleb to accept. He had one destroyed patrol vehicle, a branch that did not behave like a falling branch, tracks longer than 16 inches, a blurry camera image, and a rancher who had seen a similar figure weeks before him. Caleb still refused to call the evidence conclusive, but he could no longer call it coincidence. As he drove back toward town, one thought became impossible to push away. Whatever had stood in the road that night had been part of a larger pattern, and Caleb had only just begun to understand how long that pattern had been there. Several days after speaking with the rancher, Caleb returned to the case with a different purpose. What he needed to understand was what had happened around it. He spread his notes, photographs, patrol records, and the hunting camera timestamp across a table and began reconstructing the night minute by minute. The exercise felt more like an investigation than a personal search for answers, and that distinction mattered to him. Caleb did not want fear to become evidence. He wanted the evidence to tell him what fear had prevented him from seeing clearly. He started with the patrol radio log. His transmission requesting assistance had been recorded shortly after he reached the civilian vehicle. He compared that time with the estimated moment of the collision, then with the timestamp from the hunting camera located more than a mile away. The numbers were close enough to make him uncomfortable. The camera had captured the tall figure during the same general period in which Caleb had been facing the creature on the road. That did not prove they were connected, but it narrowed the possibility of coincidence. Caleb marked the camera location on a printed map and drew a line towards Cinder Brush Hollow. Then he added the rancher's sighting. The rancher had seen a tall figure on the ridge weeks before the patrol incident. The cattle disappearances had occurred in the same general area. The damaged fences appeared at several properties. Now the camera had recorded another large upright shape near the same forest corridor. Caleb stepped back from the map and studied the pattern. None of the individual pieces was decisive. Together, they created something he could no longer dismiss as random. He returned to the crash site in daylight again. this time walking farther beyond the point where the tracks had been found. He followed the direction of the impressions while carefully photographing the ground. Moisture had softened several marks, and sections had been disturbed by maintenance vehicles, but enough remained to establish a general route. The prints did not lead randomly into the forest. They ran beside the road for a distance before fading among thicker vegetation. He stopped beside one impression and compared it with his own boot. The difference was immediate. The footprint was broad, long, and deeply pressed into wet soil. Caleb had seen large animal tracks during years of patrol work, and he knew how misleading a partial print could be. He refused to make a conclusion from one mark. What troubled him was the sequence. The impressions appeared behind the patrol SUV and continued toward the area where he had escaped. That meant the creature could have followed his movement. Caleb stood on the road and replayed the escape in his mind. He remembered opening the passenger door, stepping into the cold air, and backing away from the SUV. He remembered keeping his eyes on the creature. He remembered running toward the other vehicle. He did not remember hearing pursuit. He had assumed the creature remained near the patrol SUV. The tracks introduced a different possibility. Perhaps the creature had moved after him without making enough noise for him to notice. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. For the first time, Caleb understood that his memory of the encounter might contain an important mistake. He had thought he was escaping from something standing behind him. The evidence suggested he might have been moving through an environment in which he was being watched from more than one direction. He returned to his notes and added a simple question beside the map. How many were there? The question stayed unanswered for several days. Caleb then contacted the owner of the hunting camera again and asked to examine the original recording rather than the still image. The owner provided the file. Caleb watched it in a quiet room at the station, slowing the footage repeatedly. At normal speed, the image showed a dark figure moving between trees. When Caleb enlarged the frame, the picture broke into pixels, but certain proportions remained visible. The figure seemed extremely tall, with a broad upper body and long arms. It moved upright, paused, and turned its head toward the camera. Caleb watched the movement again. The turn bothered him most. The creature had not simply crossed the frame. It had stopped as though it had become aware of something. The camera made no obvious noise, and there was no visible human presence nearby. Yet the figure appeared to register the device. Caleb remembered the Bigfoot on the road, looking directly through his headlights. The similarity did not prove identity, but it made him reconsider the word coincidence. He checked the timestamp once more. The camera had been positioned more than a mile away, but the distance did not necessarily make the two events unrelated. If the creature could move quickly through the forest, it could have traveled between the locations within a short period. Caleb did not know how fast it could move. He had never measured its speed. Until then, he had not even considered the question. That thought led him back to the radio log. The second low growl had occurred only seconds after the first. Caleb had initially assumed the sounds were simply echoes, or another animal responding from a distance. Now he wondered whether the two sounds had come from two different locations. If they had, then the creature on the road might have been communicating with another one. He pulled out a blank sheet of paper and marked the approximate direction from which he had heard the second sound. Then he compared it with the terrain. The forest contained ridges, depressions, and narrow corridors where sound could travel unpredictably. A precise location was impossible to establish from memory alone. Still, Caleb could not ignore the possibility that the second sound had been a response. The idea changed the emotional weight of the encounter. One Bigfoot was frightening because Caleb had no framework for it. Two or more meant the event might have involved behavior he had never considered. If the creatures could communicate, then the pause before Caleb escaped might have had a reason. Perhaps the sound had called the first creature away. Perhaps another animal had warned it about something. Perhaps the creatures were coordinating. Caleb disliked every explanation equally. He continued reviewing the earlier reports. The cattle losses were scattered across several properties, but they were concentrated along a rough corridor leading toward the deeper forest. Fences had been damaged near those properties. The rancher had seen the tall figure on the ridge. Then Caleb had encountered the creature on the road. Finally, the hunting camera had recorded a similar figure farther away. He marked each point. The map began to look less like a collection of unrelated incidents and more like a territory. That was the first major discovery Caleb made after the crash. The reports did not simply describe strange events. They described repeated activity within a connected area. The thought made him uncomfortable because it suggested the creature was not passing through by accident. It had a reason to remain there. Food was the obvious possibility. The cattle were accessible. The forest offered cover. The roads provided movement corridors. Human activity had created a landscape where a large animal could move between natural resources and populated areas without being seen continuously. Caleb understood that pattern from ordinary wildlife management, and that familiarity made the idea more disturbing. He did not need to believe in folklore to recognize a territorial animal using a predictable environment, but the behavior still did not fit an ordinary animal. The creature had not merely approached livestock. It had confronted a police vehicle. Caleb remembered the headlights falling across its body. He remembered the way it stood in the road. He remembered the branch rising in its hands. Most importantly, he remembered the pause after the impact. The creature had walked toward him when he was vulnerable, then stopped before contact. Why? Caleb considered whether the creature might have been defending territory. That explanation offered some relief. A territorial animal could use force to drive an intruder away without intending to kill it. The branch could have been a warning. The approach could have been an intimidation display. The retreat could have meant Caleb had understood the message. For a few hours, that explanation felt almost reassuring. Then Caleb remembered the second growl. If another creature had been nearby, the event could have involved something more organized than territorial defense by a single animal. The first Bigfoot might have been responding to another member of its group. Caleb could not know whether that group existed, but the possibility changed the meaning of everything he had already seen. He returned to the hunting camera footage and examined the surrounding frames. There was no second figure clearly visible. The trees were too dense, the image too poor, and the darkness too complete. Still, the tall figure appeared to pause before leaving the frame, as though listening. Caleb felt his earlier explanation becoming harder to maintain. He had entered Cinder Brush Hollow believing that strange reports were mostly misunderstandings. Now he was considering whether he had encountered an intelligent wild creature capable of observing humans, responding to them, and perhaps communicating with others of its kind. That was a much more complicated threat than a large animal. It also changed one memory in particular. When the Bigfoot had stopped in front of the damaged SUV, Caleb had assumed it was deciding whether to attack. But perhaps the creature had already made its decision before approaching. Perhaps the purpose of the encounter had been to make Caleb leave. That possibility gave the branch a different meaning. It had been powerful enough to destroy the vehicle, but the force had been controlled. The creature had not thrown random debris. It had selected a large branch, lifted it, aimed it toward the vehicle, and then stopped before reaching Caleb. Caleb wrote those observations down. He did not write that the creature had warned him. He wrote that its behavior was consistent with deliberate action. That distinction mattered to him. As a deputy, Caleb had learned to separate what he knew from what he believed. He could describe the branch, the damage, the tracks, the camera footage, and his own observation. He could not prove the creature's intention. He could only infer it from behavior. The inference still scared him. Several days later, Caleb returned to the area with the camera owner's permission to inspect the surrounding terrain. He stood on a ridge above the road and looked down toward the route where the patrol SUV had been struck. From that height, the road formed a narrow opening through the trees. Anyone moving through the area would naturally follow it. Caleb suddenly understood why he had encountered the creature there. The road was not just a place humans used. It was also an easy corridor through dense forest. He followed the ridgeline with his eyes. The rancher's property was visible farther away. The cattle pastures sat near the edge of the wooded area. The camera was positioned beyond another section of forest. All the locations connected. Caleb felt the uncomfortable sensation of being inside a map he had only just learned to read. He had once believed the creature appeared because he happened to drive into its path that night. Now he wondered whether the road itself was part of the creature's regular route. If so, his patrol had not discovered something passing through. He had entered a space that may already have been occupied. That realization made the encounter feel less random. It also raised a more troubling question. If the Bigfoot regularly moved near human properties, why had people seen so little of it? The answer might have been intelligence. Caleb had spent years observing people who knew how to avoid police attention. He understood that visibility was often a choice. A person could be present without being noticed if he understood roads, schedules, blind spots, and habits. Caleb had never imagined applying that reasoning to an animal. Yet the more he studied the evidence, the harder it became to avoid the comparison. The creature might know when humans were nearby. It might know where vehicles traveled. It might know where livestock were kept. And it might know when to disappear. The thought left Caleb quiet for a long time. He returned home that evening and placed the photographs in a folder. He did not feel victorious. If anything, the evidence had made his situation worse. Before the investigation, he had one terrifying memory. Now he had a pattern connecting several weeks of unexplained events. He still wanted an ordinary explanation. He considered bears, people, camera distortion, weather damage, and exaggerated reports. He tested each possibility against the evidence. A bear could explain some livestock losses. A person could explain a distant silhouette. Weather could damage trees. Camera distortion could make a figure appear taller. But none of those explanations comfortably explained everything together. The branch remained the hardest problem. Caleb knew what he had seen. He also knew what the branch had done. That was enough to prevent him from returning to his original belief that the crash had been an ordinary accident. The next question was even harder. If the creature had been intelligent enough to understand Caleb's presence, why had it allowed him to live? Caleb returned mentally to the final seconds before he ran. The creature had stood close enough for him to see water on its hair. Its head had tilted toward a sound only it seemed able to hear. Then the second growl had come from deeper in the woods. The creature had turned away. Caleb had always assumed that moment represented his chance to escape. Now he wondered whether the creature had been the one making the decision. Perhaps the second sound had called it away. Perhaps another creature had warned it. Or perhaps the first Bigfoot had already decided that the patrol vehicle had been driven far enough into its territory, and that destroying the vehicle was sufficient. None of those possibilities made Caleb feel safe. They all required the same uncomfortable conclusion. The creature had exercised some form of choice. That was the midpoint. Caleb could not escape. He no longer viewed Bigfoot as a mysterious animal that had attacked because of confusion or fear. He began to see it as a highly capable creature whose motives were unknown. The difference was enormous. Fear came from strength, but uncertainty came from intelligence. And intelligence meant the encounter could not be reduced to instinct. For the first time, Caleb wondered whether the most important evidence from that night was not the branch, the damaged SUV, or even the footprints. It was the creature's behavior. It had seen him. It had demonstrated what it could do. It had approached him. Then it had stopped. Caleb could not prove why. But that unanswered question changed the meaning of everything that had happened before. For a short time, he allowed himself to believe that this might be the end of it. The evidence had been gathered, the vehicle had been documented, and the strange figure had disappeared. If he stayed away from Cinderbrush Hollow, perhaps the memory would eventually become something he could place behind him. That hope lasted only until he looked again at the map. The marked locations formed a corridor around the same forest. The rancher had seen the figure weeks earlier. The cattle had disappeared. The camera had recorded a similar shape. The tracks had followed the road after Caleb escaped, and somewhere beyond the trees, another low voice had answered the first. Caleb stared at the marks on the paper and finally understood that his encounter had not been the beginning of the story. It had been the moment when the story became impossible for him to ignore. Caleb Mercer had spent nearly 2 weeks trying to convince himself that leaving the case alone was the responsible thing to do. The official report had been filed, the damaged patrol SUV had been photographed and removed, and the strange evidence around Cinderbrush Hollow had been documented without any conclusion that could survive serious scrutiny. He should have been able to close the folder and return to normal patrol work. Instead, every time he opened a map of the county, his eyes went toward the same stretch of forest. He remembered the figure in the headlights, the branch rising in its hands, and the second sound answering from somewhere beyond the trees. What bothered him most was not that he had seen something he could not explain. It was that the experience had changed the way he understood his own job. Caleb had always believed that uncertainty was temporary. You gathered evidence, asked questions, and eventually reduced the unknown to something manageable. Cinderbrush Hollow had resisted that process. The more carefully he examined it, the less comfortable the remaining questions became. He began sleeping poorly. Some nights he woke before dawn with the sensation that he had heard a low vibration outside his house. He would sit up, listen, and hear only the refrigerator cycling in the kitchen, or wind moving through the trees beyond the property. He knew those sounds were ordinary, yet his body reacted before his mind could correct it. The memory of the road returned without warning. He could still see the creature standing beneath the headlights, its wet hair reflecting pale light, its enormous arms hanging beside its body. He could still remember the deliberate way it had turned toward the forest before the second growl came. Caleb did not want fear to control his decisions, but he also understood that fear sometimes carried information. His instincts had kept him alive that night. He had no intention of ignoring them now. The final decision came after another routine shift. Caleb was reviewing patrol assignments when he saw that he had been scheduled to cover the same general area near Cinderbrush Hollow. The assignment was ordinary on paper, but he felt a physical tightening in his chest as soon as he read the location. He stared at the schedule for several seconds, then closed the file. He realized that returning there in uniform would force him to make a choice he was not prepared to make. If he encountered the creature again, he would have to respond as a deputy. If he reported what he had seen, he would risk turning the department toward an investigation that nobody had requested and few people would take seriously. If he remained silent, he would be carrying the same uncertainty into another patrol. None of those options felt responsible. Caleb finally understood that his problem was no longer whether he believed in Bigfoot. His problem was that he knew something was operating in that forest, and he did not know its intentions. That distinction was enough. He submitted his resignation from field patrol duties and requested a transfer away from the area. The decision was not dramatic. He completed the paperwork, handed over his equipment according to procedure, and explained that the crash had changed his willingness to work extended night assignments. His supervisors accepted the explanation. Caleb did not feel relieved. He felt as though he had stepped away from something unfinished. On his last evening near the station, he drove toward Cinder Brush Hollow one final time, stopping well short of the original crash site. He remained inside his vehicle with the engine off and watched the forest from the roadside. The trees were black against the fading sky. Nothing moved, nothing called. The silence should have made him feel safer, but instead it reminded him of how easily something enormous could remain unseen. Caleb looked at the road and remembered how certain he had been that he was alone when he first stopped the patrol SUV. Now he understood that the forest had probably never been empty. He turned the vehicle around and drove home without getting out. 2 days later, Caleb left the department's field rotation behind and moved temporarily to his sister's property in another part of the county. He told himself that distance would help. Without the uniform, the radio, and the responsibility of responding to calls, he expected the memory to lose some of its weight. For a short time, it did. He spent his mornings walking, repairing equipment, and sorting through personal belongings. He avoided news about Cinder Brush Hollow. He stopped checking local reports. He even packed away the photographs from the investigation. The routine helped him breathe more normally. Then a package arrived from the maintenance worker who had discovered the large tracks. Inside were copies of several photographs taken after Caleb had left the area. The worker had not known exactly what the images meant, but he believed Caleb should see them. Caleb spread the photographs across the kitchen table. The first showed the original track beside the road. The second showed another impression farther into the woods. The third captured a section of disturbed ground near a narrow creek. Caleb studied each image carefully. The marks appeared fresher than the ones he had examined earlier. That alone made his stomach tighten. The animal, whatever it was, had remained active in the area after his departure. He turned the third photograph over and noticed a handwritten date. It had been taken less than 48 hours after the patrol vehicle was destroyed. Caleb felt the old tension return. He remembered believing that the encounter had ended when he reached the civilian vehicle. The photographs suggested otherwise. Something had continued moving through the same corridor after he left. He placed the pictures in chronological order and noticed another detail. The later tracks seemed to move away from the road toward the creek. The direction was different from the earlier path. Caleb studied a map of the area and realized that the creek eventually led toward a deeper section of forest that contained no houses, no roads, and very little human traffic. If the creature was using the corridor regularly, that remote area could have been its primary refuge. Caleb did not know whether there was one creature or several. He only knew that the evidence pointed toward a place where humans rarely went. He felt an unexpected relief at that thought. A hidden refuge meant distance. Distance meant fewer encounters. At the same time, it made him wonder how much of the forest had remained invisible to people for generations. The next piece of evidence came from the hunting camera owner. He had reviewed older recordings after Caleb left and discovered several frames that had previously seemed unimportant. Caleb traveled to meet him and watched the footage in silence. The images were poor, but the timestamps created a pattern. A large, dark figure, apart on 3 separate nights over a period of several weeks. The figure never approached the camera directly. It crossed behind the trees, paused briefly, and continued. In one frame, another shape appeared deeper in the background. It was smaller and partially hidden, but it seemed to move in the same direction as the larger figure. Caleb leaned closer to the screen. The second shape disappeared almost immediately, leaving no way to determine what it was. He watched the frame repeatedly. He wanted the image to resolve into something ordinary. It never did. The camera owner noticed Caleb's reaction, but did not press him. Caleb appreciated that silence. He had spent enough time worrying about how people would react to his story. What mattered now was what the evidence could support. The footage did not prove multiple Bigfoots. It did, however, make Caleb reconsider the second growl he had heard on the night of the crash. Perhaps he had not imagined the sense that another presence was nearby. Perhaps the answer had been there all along, hidden in a sound he could not interpret. Caleb drove home with the footage still in his mind. He stopped at a roadside overlook and sat in the parked vehicle for several minutes. The mountains stretched across the horizon beneath a pale afternoon sky. The view was peaceful, almost ordinary. Yet Caleb found himself thinking about the forest below the ridges, about how much territory could remain unseen even in a county where people believed they knew every road. He realized that his fear had changed. At first, he had been afraid of being attacked. Now he was more troubled by the possibility that the creature had understood him. A violent animal was dangerous, but an intelligent creature that preferred distance was something different. Caleb began wondering whether the Bigfoot had been trying to communicate in the only way it could. The branch could have been a warning. The approach could have been intimidation. The retreat could have been deliberate. Even the destruction of the vehicle might have served a purpose beyond simple aggression. If that was true, Caleb had misunderstood the encounter from the beginning. The creature may not have wanted him dead. It may have wanted him gone. That possibility gave him a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief because it meant the encounter had not necessarily been an attempt to kill him. Unease because it suggested the creature had made a decision about him. Caleb thought back to the moment when their eyes met. He remembered the creature's stillness. It had not seemed confused. It had not seemed frantic. It had appeared to evaluate him. That memory became harder to dismiss with every new piece of evidence. Weeks passed. Caleb kept his distance from Cinder Brush Hollow, but reports continued to reach him indirectly. A rancher mentioned unusual movement near a fence line. A trail camera recorded a large shadow. Another resident reported a low call late at night. None of the incidents produced enough evidence to justify a formal investigation. Caleb heard them through people who knew he had once worked the area. Each report reopened the same question. He began keeping a private notebook. He wrote down dates, locations, weather conditions, and descriptions exactly as people remembered them. He avoided adding interpretations. The notebook became a way of controlling his own uncertainty. Whenever he felt tempted to write Bigfoot, he described the observable detail instead. Tall figure, upright movement, large tracks, low vocalization, damaged fence, missing livestock. That discipline helped him separate memory from belief. It also revealed something he had not noticed before. The reports tended to cluster around the edges of the forest rather than deep inside it. The creature or creatures seemed to approach human territory, but rarely remained there for long. That pattern supported Caleb's growing belief that they were avoiding direct contact. Yet the patrol vehicle incident remained an exception. He had not been trespassing intentionally. He had simply driven a public road. If the creature wanted to avoid humans, why confront him so openly? Caleb could not answer. One evening, while reviewing the notebook, he noticed that the crash had occurred during a period when several cattle had recently disappeared. That timing made him reconsider another possibility. Perhaps the creature had not been reacting to Caleb personally. Perhaps the patrol vehicle had entered an area the creature was actively protecting because food or another animal was nearby. Maybe Caleb had unknowingly crossed into a temporary territory. The second growl might have come from a companion or a larger group. If so, the encounter could have been about protecting something Caleb never saw. That idea changed the emotional meaning of the night. He remembered the creature turning its head toward the forest before approaching him. At the time, he had assumed it was preparing to attack. Now, he wondered whether it had been listening for another member of its group or watching over a hidden location. Caleb understood that he was building theories from incomplete evidence, but he could not stop himself. Human beings search for motives because uncertainty is difficult to live with. Caleb wanted the creature to have a reason that made sense. He wanted the event to fit into a recognizable pattern. The forest refused to provide that comfort. 1 month after the crash, Caleb returned to Cinderbrush Hollow in daylight without entering the deeper woods. He parked near the same road and walked a short distance toward the old scene. The patrol vehicle was gone. The branch had been removed. Tire marks had faded. At first, the place looked ordinary. Then Caleb noticed a fresh mark on the trunk of a nearby tree. It was high above his head, where a person would have needed to reach or climb. The bark had been stripped in a narrow vertical section. Caleb touched the exposed wood and felt an unexpected heaviness in his chest. He did not know whether the mark was made by the creature. He could not even prove it was recent. Still, the height forced him to look upward. The surrounding trees seemed suddenly larger than before. He stepped back and scanned the forest. For several minutes he heard nothing. Then a distant branch moved. Caleb froze. The movement was subtle, barely more than a dark shift between trunks. He waited. Another branch moved farther away. He could not see a body. He could not confirm a shape. His instincts told him to leave. Caleb listened to that instinct. He walked back to his vehicle without turning the moment into a confrontation. Leaving was safer than pretending the forest had nothing left to reveal. Instead, he remembered the encounter exactly as it had happened. A patrol car on a dark road, a massive figure in the headlights, a branch thrown with controlled force, a second sound in the trees, and a creature that had every opportunity to continue but chose to stop. Caleb had left the forest because he believed distance would make the experience smaller. Instead, distance had given him time to see its larger shape. The evidence after his departure showed that the encounter had been part of an ongoing pattern, and the pattern suggested intelligence, restraint, and territory. Those qualities made the mystery deeper, not simpler. Caleb never learned whether there had been one Bigfoot in Cinderbrush Hollow or several. He never discovered what the creature had been protecting, where it went after leaving the road, or why it had allowed him to walk away. What he did know was enough to change him. Before that night, he had believed the wilderness was dangerous because people could become careless inside it. Afterward, he understood that the wilderness could contain lives that existed completely outside human expectations. Some might avoid us. Some might watch us. And some might step into the road only once, long enough to remind us that we were never as alone as we believed. After leaving Cinderbrush Hollow, Caleb Mercer tried to live as though that night had been nothing more than an unusual accident he had been lucky to survive. He no longer patrolled the area, no longer had to look at the roads leading into the forest, and no longer carried responsibility for explaining the strange reports that other people sent in. But distance did not erase the memory. Whenever he drove past another stretch of woodland, Caleb still slowed instinctively, watching the dark spaces between the trunks and wondering whether he was seeing a movement that someone else would overlook. He understood that it was no longer simple fear. It was more like a form of alertness that had become part of his reflexes, something his body had learned during those few minutes on the fog-covered road in 2023. Caleb had once believed that time would make the experience smaller. Instead, time only helped him see it more clearly. As the first emotions faded, he began remembering details he had been too shaken to evaluate that night. He remembered the way the creature stood in the road without panicking beneath the headlights. He remembered its unusually broad shoulders, its long arms, its wet coat, and the eyes fixed directly on him. Most of all, he remembered the moment it lifted the branch. Caleb had studied the damaged vehicle many times and wondered why the impact had been so precise. The branch was large enough to crush the windshield, but it had not traveled in a chaotic path. It had been lifted, brought forward, and thrown with controlled force. Then the creature approached Caleb but stopped before touching him. If its purpose had been to kill him, the night probably would have ended very differently. That thought did not make Caleb feel safer. Instead, it unsettled him for a deeper reason. The creature had possessed the strength to do something worse, but it had chosen not to. Caleb did not know whether that choice came from instinct, territorial behavior, curiosity, or a kind of awareness humans did not understand. He only knew that it had seen him, and he had seen it. The official report remained unchanged. The branch was recorded as the cause of the damage, while the marks on the ground were considered too unclear to support a meaningful conclusion. There was no line in the report mentioning Bigfoot. Caleb had deliberately kept that part out. At first, he believed his silence protected his career and his credibility. Later, he realized it protected something else as well. He did not want to turn a confusing encounter into a story that would send people searching for the creature. If the animal truly existed, revealing its location could permanently change the forest. Curious people would come. Hunters might follow. Others seeking proof, attention, or money could push deeper into a place where the creature had apparently remained hidden for a very long time. Caleb did not know whether it understood people the way people understood one another, but he knew it had avoided humans for years. Perhaps that avoidance was exactly why it had survived. So Caleb kept his version of the truth in a private notebook. He recorded dates, locations, directions of movement, vocalizations, footprints, and everything he had personally observed. He did not add details he could not prove. He also refused to turn the creature into a monster. After months of thinking about the encounter, Caleb no longer viewed it as a story about a monster attacking a police officer. To him, it was an encounter between two species sharing the same land without understanding each other. Humans saw the forest as a place to cross, work in, explore, or use. The creature might have seen it as home. When Caleb's vehicle entered that road that night, he may have unknowingly crossed into a space the creature considered its own. The branch could have been a warning. The impact could have been its way of forcing a human intruder to leave. The second call might have come from another individual. Caleb did not know which explanation was correct. The only thing he could say with confidence was that the creature's actions appeared purposeful. That changed the way he remembered the final moments. At first he remembered running because he was afraid he would die. Later, he began wondering whether the creature had allowed him to run. That thought stayed with him longer than any bruise from the crash. Caleb often asked himself why it had let him live. The question had no answer, but it made him reconsider every detail. If it only wanted to remove a threat, damaging the vehicle had been enough to make him leave. If it wanted him dead, it had an opportunity when Caleb stepped out. If it was curious, perhaps it had only wanted to observe his reaction. If it was defending territory, perhaps it had achieved its purpose when the human left. Each possibility seemed reasonable at some level, but none could be proven. Caleb learned to accept that. He had once believed that someone doing his job should always have an answer. Eventually, he understood that sometimes the greatest responsibility was recognizing when there was no answer and refusing to pretend otherwise. One winter morning, Caleb opened the old notebook for the last time. The first pages were filled with cold, precise observations that looked almost like official reports. The later pages contained personal thoughts he had once been reluctant to write. He read everything from beginning to end. When he reached the description of the encounter, he stopped for a long time. He remembered the creature's eyes beneath the headlights. He remembered the silence between them. He remembered the distant sound in the forest, and the moment the creature turned toward it. Caleb realized that what disturbed him most was not its size, it was its control. A creature that powerful had not behaved chaotically. It had made choices. That taught Caleb that strength was not the most frightening thing. The frightening part was not knowing what directed that strength. He closed the notebook and placed it in a drawer. He had no intention of publishing the story. He had no intention of returning to hunt for more evidence. For him, that was no longer necessary. He had seen enough to know that parts of the world still existed beyond human understanding. Sometimes, seeing something unexplained did not mean people needed to possess it, name it, or drag it out of the darkness. Caleb continued his life. He worked ordinary jobs, met ordinary people, and gradually became comfortable with the feeling of not constantly watching the forest. Still, whenever someone mentioned strange sounds or unusually large tracks in the area, he listened. He no longer laughed at stories like that. He also did not immediately believe them. He simply listened, because he understood that between disbelief and certainty there was a wide space where the truth could exist. Years later, Caleb still kept the original official report. If another person read it, they would see an accident caused by a falling branch during bad weather. They would not know about the enormous figure standing in the road. They would not know about the second call, the tracks following his escape route, or the moment when a creature he could not identify had looked directly at him. They would never know that for a few minutes, Caleb had stood before something he could not fit into any familiar category. He accepted that the official file would never tell the whole truth. One part of the story belonged to the paperwork. The rest belonged to his memory. Perhaps that was where it needed to remain. Caleb never learned whether the creature still lived around Cinderbrush Hollow or had moved elsewhere. He never discovered how many individuals might have existed in the forests behind the ranches. He never learned whether the second call had belonged to another creature or to a sound he had simply never heard before. He did not know whether the creature remembered the encounter. But he remembered it. He remembered enough to understand that he had been fortunate. Not because he had defeated something dangerous, but because he had been allowed to leave. That became the way Caleb finally understood the night. He did not consider himself a survivor of an attack. He considered himself a man who had entered a world that was not his, received a warning, and then been permitted to walk away. The thought made him more humble. It also gave him a respect for wilderness that years of police work had never taught him. For a long time, Caleb also wondered whether he should have reported everything before leaving the area. Sometimes he imagined a different version of events, in which he had written the full account, included every photograph, and asked the department to investigate the forest. In that version, more officers might have entered the hollow. Search teams might installed along the ridge. Cameras might have been installed along the ridge. The creature might have been photographed clearly, perhaps even approached. Whenever Caleb imagined that possibility, he felt the same discomfort. Proof would have answered one question while creating many others. Once the creature became known, it would no longer have the quiet protection of uncertainty. People would come looking for it, and some would come with motives Caleb could not control. He finally decided that keeping silent had been less about hiding the truth than refusing to become the reason someone else entered those woods carelessly. He understood that choice might frustrate people who wanted evidence, but he could live with that. He had learned that surviving an encounter sometimes meant carrying unanswered questions instead of forcing an answer that could cause more harm. The forest had given him one clear lesson: not everything hidden needs to be found. There was another lesson he carried quietly. Caleb had spent years believing that courage meant moving toward danger when everyone else moved away. That belief had served him well in emergencies, but Cinderbrush Hollow taught him that courage could also mean recognizing when curiosity had become reckless. He felt grateful that he had listened to the instinct that told him to turn around. Whenever he remembered the road, he pictured the creature one final time, standing beneath the headlights, powerful enough to destroy the vehicle, but restrained enough to let him go. That image never became comforting. It simply became familiar, like an old scar that no longer hurt but still marked the place where something important had happened. A forest is silent without being empty. Trees can stand perfectly still while lives humans have never understood move somewhere beyond them. Caleb once believed his duty was to protect people from dangerous things. After Cinderbrush Hollow, he understood that protection could sometimes mean knowing when to step back. He had stepped back that night. It may have been the best decision he ever made. During one final look at his old map, Caleb realized he did not need more evidence to change what he believed. What he needed was to accept his own limits and respect the distance that the forest had maintained between two different worlds. In the years that followed, whenever the memory returned, Caleb remembered the same thing. He had seen it, and it had seen him. Neither side understood what the other truly wanted. But in that moment, between the vehicle's headlights and the fog-covered forest, two worlds had seen each other. Caleb still did not know why the creature let him live. Perhaps he would never know. The question remained with him, no longer as an obsession, but as a reminder that the world was larger than anything humans could fully explain. And for Caleb, that became the most important truth of Cinderbrush Hollow.